Hi all, my name is Peyton Gordon, and today I'm going to be going over productive and counterproductive behaviors within the workplace today. So the first question asks, how have recent historical events affected the course of research in organizational psychology? And to give an example of an event and the resulting outcome from that. So obviously there's been a great deal of historical events that have obviously helped create the field of IO. Obviously the field of psychology is a fairly relatively young field. So along as well as the IO field is very young as well. So the IO field was essentially created in the early 1900s. Taylor and Weber were the main patriarchs of essentially the IO field of study. So Taylor introduced development and growth, whereas Weber introduced the study of organizational structures. From about 1920 to 1930, the Hawthorne studies were introduced along with the aspect of unionization. And then from 1940 to 1970, the IO field grew significantly, mainly due to the wars that took place during this time period. So you have World War II, where the human relations perspective was essentially created, and then you have the Vietnam War, where IO essentially became a multifaceted field of study. So at this point, the field began to acknowledge topics such as stress, work-family conflict, and retirement. And then from 1980 to present, obviously you see the field grow even more. You see the changing workforce demographics. You also see an advancement in technology, and you also have a greater focus on retirement. So all of those historical events have essentially helped create and mold the field of IO as we know it today. Now, personally, an event I believe that had a really big impact on this field was essentially something that happened during World War II. So obviously during World War II, a lot of the men went off to fight in the war. And so because of that, the factories that the men worked in previously were now vacated. And so women had to step into that role. So essentially, because women had to step into the workforce to make up for the men going to war, a new essentially terminology kind of came to life, and it's all about diversity. And so during the World War II period, you saw a great diversity within the workforce, mainly between males and females. Obviously, because during that time period, a lot of the women stayed at home. They were the women kept the home running. They were the housekeepers. They cleaned, they cooked, they took care of the family while the husband was essentially the breadwinner of the family. And so because of that, women hadn't really gone into the workforce before. So this was the first time that we really saw, and at least in American history, where women were going into the workforce. And because of that, you have the introduction of diversity. And so essentially these historical events affected the growth of the IO field significantly, because during each of these periods, essentially a different situation was introduced regarding the workplace and workplace environment. And so without these significant events, the IO field essentially would not exist. So the second question states, to describe the socialization process for kind of graduate students in your program, and how it's been successful in essentially socializing newcomers and job embeddedness. So a little bit of my background is I received my undergraduate degree from Liberty, and then obviously I am in the IO master's program here as well. And so from my perspective, I believe that Liberty does a great job with the socialization process. And so just to define the socialization process, essentially what that is where newcomers come in, and they're essentially called outsiders, and they become insiders of a company or an organization. And so this is where during that onboarding process, or during their newcomer phase, they learn about the politics, the language, the history, and the people within a company's organization. And so once again, I believe that Liberty's socialization process, at least for students, is very good. I believe that essentially, obviously with a master's program like this, everything everything is online, so it can sometimes be a struggle to get connected to others, but I believe LUO provides a lot of resources to get into contact with other students and professors within your specific degree program. I also believe that Liberty provides a great deal of extra academic help, so whether that's tutoring services or something like that, that's also provided for Liberty grad students as well. Another thing that I think is crucial to the socialization process at Liberty, or what makes Liberty's socialization process such a success for Liberty, is essentially the professors. They're kind of like a supervisor for the university. So obviously in the classes I've had up until this point, I do have a lot of professors who are more than willing to meet on Teams meetings and to discuss the work that's coming up for the following week, or they will record and do webinars. And so individuals are able to hop on and kind of listen to a professor lecture. So it's a lot like in-person classes. Having that feature and option, I think, really sets Liberty's IO program above par and above reproach, just because professors do take that extra step and that time to set aside and meet with the student if they have any questions, or to further explain assignments that need to be completed. And I believe that Liberty also does a great job outside of the professors by reaching their students. They also have the LUO call center. So the call center will essentially reach out to you to make sure that you don't have any questions regarding registration, or that you don't need any help with that. So I believe that Liberty, in regards to the socialization process, provides a lot of great resources and tools to become really a part of the university. And then in terms of creating job embeddedness, I take this as the assignments that I'm required to do each week, and in every class that I've taken under this program has been phenomenal, because essentially a lot of what I have to do is applying my research or applying what I've read to real life situations, which helps me in my current role now. So I believe that professors really do try to create assignments that can be applied to life and can be very beneficial to the student as well. And then moving on to question 3, it states that how can an organization reduce or prevent work-family conflict? So we all know there's this delicate balance between work and family. Work is obviously a separate and distinct aspect of an individual's life. Therefore, it demands a healthy balance between the two areas. There are a few ways in which organizations can reduce or prevent work-family conflict. So obviously, everybody has a family, and depending on the size of your family, sometimes more individuals might be in and out of work than others. And there's just that unique balance between the two, because sometimes as a parent, you'll have to leave and go take your kid to a doctor's appointment. They might have a soccer game. You might have to leave work early and what have you. So there is this delicate balance of, I need to help take care of my family, but I also need to do my job. And so how can organizations essentially prevent any sort of conflict that might arise between work and family? And so a major way to reduce stresses is by working with an employee and being a flexible employer. So you want to work for a company that values family and sees family as just a priority, and that it comes first over your job. And so working for an employer that understands that, they're naturally going to be a little bit more flexible with your work schedule and what you need to get done yourself. But employers can also institute work-family policies. And so essentially, these are policies that institutionalize benefits that seek to balance this work-family relationship. And so some of these benefits might be an on-site daycare, flex time, job sharing, telecommuting, or providing other parents for children, parents, or elders as well. And then once again, the biggest aspect of this is another way to kind of reduce this as well, is having a supervisor who essentially models a family supportive supervisor behavior. So, this is essentially a supervisor who understands the importance of family, but also institutes what the university policy has to say regarding individuals' benefits and their work family benefits specifically. So, an example of this might be an employee that has to leave early because their kid has a doctor's appointment and might miss half a day, and the supervisor is very understanding and lets them go take care of that need. Or on a bigger scale, maybe you have an employee who just lost a parent, and so they have the surviving spouse that they need to take care of, and they might need some of that flex time to be able to go take care of that relative. And you have a supervisor that says, hey, I totally understand where you're coming from. I'm going to go ahead and let you do that. So essentially, a company can institute family benefits and work family policies as much as possible, but it really does kind of boil down to the supervisor and how the supervisor implements that as well. So that kind of brings us into question 4. And it says, imagine you've been asked to develop a performance assessment program for employee development. What techniques could you use to adequately evaluate employees' performance as comprehensively as possible? So for me personally, I believe in order to create a successful performance assessment program, one obviously has to create an adequate technique to be successful in this regard. So essentially the techniques that I would use, or the questions that I would ask, are much more attitude and behavior focused. I have currently been in a manager role in my HR department for a few months now, and I have found that a lot of it has to do with behavior. And so the techniques that I would use to kind of evaluate that would be their task-oriented behavior, their downtime behavior, and then they're demonstrating efforts to get tasks done, and then their personal discipline. And so essentially these techniques would help employees to kind of see where they're at on a scale of kind of 1 to 10 regarding attitude. And so personally, once again, I believe what determines a good worker is essentially their attitude. If you have someone who's got a bad attitude, it can be hard to get a job done effectively. Does mental ability factor into these techniques? Yes, it does, or it factors into how well a job is done, of course. But at the same time, I believe that the attitude is everything here, and that helping employees to see where they're at from an EQ standpoint in terms of that emotional cognition and that attitude, I believe is going to reap more benefits, because it can give them a more realistic view of how they need to carry themselves within the workplace, specifically with a task-oriented behavior. So if you ask someone on your team to complete a specific task, and say it was last minute, it's 4:30 on a Friday, and they're running around trying to get everything else done before the weekend, and then you give them this task to do, what is their behavior like? What is that displayed to you? What does that look like? How are they responding to the situation of, oh no, I just received all of this work, how am I going to handle all of this? So being able to give employees a critique of their behavior will essentially allow them to become even better employees, especially since they know kind of where their behavior level is at. And this gives the supervisor the opportunity to kind of speak to the employee's strengths as well, and it helps them kind of monitor essentially their behavior throughout the day with these techniques. And so this technique mirrors a lot of Murphy's List, but I draw from that just because in my manager role, I think that it would be extremely beneficial to implement more of a behavior and attitude focused performance eval than anything else. So kind of moving into my last question, it says, what are some possible common organizational constraints, and how could they lead to counterproductive work behavior? So counterproductive work behavior can essentially be brought on by the constraints of work. So the definition of counterproductive work behavior is essentially defined as the violational acts that harm the organization or employees within the organization. So examples of this would kind of be extended breaks, being late to work, working overtime without permission, or ignoring a coworker and just being rude. And essentially, though there are hundreds of counterproductive work behavior examples out there, sometimes that behavior is brought on by the constraints of a specific working environment. And then there are essentially two counterproductive work behaviors. Essentially, there's the situation based, and then there's the person based. So you obviously have the person who personality really determines a lot about their behavior in the workplace. So if someone's personality is just generally very pessimistic, or just generally doesn't care, they're there to do the bare minimum. They might try to squeeze in a little overtime where they can for extra pay, but they don't get it approved. You're going to have kind of that personality. But then you also have the situation based. And I believe that's where that counterproductive work behavior is essentially very defined, because work brings that on. So an example of this is you might have an employee who is highly monitored by their supervisor. The individual is very micromanaged, and they don't have the autonomy to do their job, and they feel like they're always being watched. Here you may not see counterwork productive on display, maybe as readily as you might see it from an employee who is not being micromanaged. So you might have an employee who has really been given the free reins to kind of do whatever they please. But because of that, that might instigate or institute a lackadaisical behavior. So they might start coming into work late, or they might start working overtime without permission because they're working under the assumption that they just can do that. One thing that my department and my coworkers say all the time, and it's kind of a rule that we live by within my department, is just don't assume. And so if you're not assuming anything, it kind of protects you from having this counterproductive work behavior. So those are some more situation based. So really heavily, from my perspective, depends on the person supervising you as well. And so those constraints can essentially impact how a job is done. And so for someone who is feeling micromanaged, they might feel very out of control because they're being so controlled, and they might feel a sense of dread and anxiety because their work is constantly being scrutinized. And so they just might feel that they have to sneak something by their supervisor because their supervisor is constantly watching them, and they're afraid to get in trouble. So because of that, that's going to produce counterproductive work behavior. So that concludes my answers for the productive and counterproductive assignment.